Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello everyone, welcome, and thank you all for coming this morning on this beautiful rainy morning. I'm just saying this for the recording purposes, but in case you had any doubt, today is Friday, April 14th. It's 9 a.m. sharp, and you're at Changing the World Through Art and Pop Culture. Before any introductions, I'd like to kick off by reading CU's land acknowledgement statement. Quote, today we would like to acknowledge that Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of Indigenous peoples who have traversed, lived in, and stewarded lands in the Boulder Valley since time immemorial. Those Indigenous nations include the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. Just some housekeeping notes. We'll reserve time at the end of the discussion for Q&A. We're using a note card system, which some of you may already be familiar with, to receive questions from the audience. If you would like to pose a question, simply raise your hand at any time during the session to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers who are standing by here. Please write legibly. If you are a student, please note that in your question on the card. When you finish writing your question, raise your hand and hand your card back to the producer who will bring it up to myself. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. I won't be able to get to all of the questions submitted most likely, but and may combine similar questions. With that said, I'll just get right into it. I will introduce myself. My name is Jane Burke. I'm the curator of the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art, right here in Boulder. Prior to joining BMOCA, I've held positions in both encyclopedic and contemporary museums over the past 20 years. Most recently at the Denver Art Museum, and prior to that at the Honolulu Museum of Art. I have an interdisciplinary master's in Asian art history from the University of Hawaii in Manoa, and an undergrad from right here at CU Boulder in studio art. Despite being an alum, this is my first time to CWA, so I'm excited to be in the fold here, and I'm really honored to be on this esteemed panel with guests that I'm looking forward to talking with as much as I think you're excited to hear from. So I'll just briefly introduce them to the best of my ability, and then they'll have the chance to, speak on behalf of themselves. Starting with maybe the hardest person to encapsulate first. Thank goodness Dave Clarke is here to introduce himself. His accolades and associated Rolodex run too deep for me to easily summarize. He's a true global leader who developed the David Clarke Cause, which, quote, creates cause brands that inspire and endure. Clarke spearheaded the World Healing Project, became the CEO of Art for Amnesty, and founded Right Here, Right Now for Global Climate Alliance with global partner United Nations for Human Rights, which he'll explain better than I just did. His collaborators include the cream of the crop of the A-list, starting with Muhammad Ali, Nelson Mandela, Yoko Ono, Leonardo DiCaprio, Quincy Jones. Not to mention has worked with legendary musicians from Prince to Beyonce to Cher to Bono to Cat Stevens, Willie Nelson, and The Cure. I mean, everybody. So thank you, Dave, for being here. And then I'll just go down the line with full disclosure, Emilie, who's my friend. Emilie Upczak is also an independent filmmaker and an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts, and the associate faculty director of the Brockage Center for Media Arts right here at the University of Colorado. Upczak spent 10 years in Trinidad and Tobago, concurrently making her debut narrative feature film, Moving Parts, while operating as creative director for the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, where she spearheaded the Caribbean Film Database and the Caribbean Film Mart. She was awarded the Center for Humanities and Art Fellowship to work with the rare and distinctive collections at the University of Colorado Libraries on a digital exhibition on Anne Roy, an American poet, mystic, and feminist activist. She is also in the midst of developing her second feature film, a climate drama to be set in the near future on the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. Next up, we have Josh Larsen, who I think has become an institution in his own right at the Conference of World Affairs, having led Iber Interruptus at the conference since 2017. After gaining success as a film critic for the Chicago-based Sun-Times Media and throughout the International Film Festival circuit. In 2011, he joined the Christian media landscape as editor, producer, and podcast host of Think Christian, a website exploring faith and pop culture. And in 2012, he joined the long-running weekly podcast Film Spotting on WBEZ in Chicago. He is also author of Movies Are Prayers, published in 2017, where Larsen, quote, encourages us to rethink movies as not just vehicles for content, but as actual expressions of the heart's deepest longings, readjusting the way we think about both films and their creators, and by extension, ourselves as viewers and critics, end quote. His next book, tentatively titled Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror, is expected out this year. Still true?
Still true, as far as I know.
Fantastic. And last but not least, we have Millie Chen. Millie Chen is an interdisciplinary artist and academic who is currently a professor at the Department of Art at the University of Buffalo. I'm trying to recruit you subliminally. In Buffalo, in New York. Her artwork has been shown across the world, most notably in New York, Toronto, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, Paris, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Her work is in the permanent collection here at the University of Boulder, the University of Colorado at Boulder, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Art Bank of Canada, Council for the Arts, Canadian Pacific Railway, and Toronto Transit Commission. She has produced numerous permanent public art commissions and published in the US, UK, and China. Her research and practice is rooted in a commitment to social justice, social inquiry, and the use of visual, audio, and performative works to interrupt and interrogate habits of viewing. Whew, we made it through. So now I'll let the speakers speak for themselves, starting with Dave.
Well, hello, everyone. So this is kind of a unique experience for me because I'm usually behind the scenes and very happy to have other people speak into the microphone. So bear with me here. So about 28 years ago, I lived in New York City, and I wanted to create a company that could create what I call cause brands around social justice issues. Because at the time, corporate social responsibility was the big rage, but it was pretty anemic. So fortuitously for me, I was friends with Muhammad Ali's biographer, and he said, David, I'm trying to convince Muhammad, as the most famous person on planet Earth, to promote tolerance and understanding and combat bigotry and prejudice. Do you have any ideas? And luckily, I'm like, I don't want to be a vendor in this equation. I want to be Muhammad's partner. So it took 1.5 years to conclude the contract, and we launched the World Healing Project. And so we came out with a book that talked, where Muhammad, his very first book, he talked about tolerance and understanding. And the brand that I came up with after reading his manuscript was simple. Everything Muhammad was talking about was healing racial divides, healing this, healing that. And healing is a great word for him because his name sits in the middle, H-E-A-L-I-N-G. So we created the World Healing Project. And working with Muhammad was unique because I know I was his partner, but all of a sudden pop culture came to our doorstep. So as an example, Muhammad's voice was starting to shake with Parkinson's when we did our big press event for MTV. And I had just read somewhere that the artist formerly known as Prince had never met his hero, Muhammad. So I called Prince's manager, and I'm like, Muhammad would like you too. And in 24 hours, Prince was joining us at our press conference. So that project led me to an amateur boxer in South Africa who was a fan of Muhammad's, and that was Nelson Mandela. So before Mandela became Mandela, he was an amateur boxer. And so he loved the work that we did for the World Healing Project. So I actually got to go to South Africa, have dinner with President Mandela, and the idea was, President Mandela, could you do something on Human Rights Day? You're probably the biggest icon on the planet. And I was surprised. He said, no, I can't talk about human rights. I have to talk about HIV/AIDS because, you know, my population is suffering, and if I talk about human rights, I'm going to look like I'm out of touch. And luckily, I had read some statistics, and my pushback was, well, millions of people have died, and they're going to continue to die, not because they're sick, they're going to die because they're poor, right? Magic Johnson's doing just fine. And if you let somebody die because they're poor, that's not a health issue, it's a human rights failure. And so the president agreed that he could actually rebrand AIDS. So we brought Oprah Winfrey down. And by the way, sorry for all this name dropping. So we brought Oprah Winfrey down to South Africa. We did a press conference. Nelson Mandela rebranded AIDS, and then we launched the 46664 initiative in Cape Town. Now, the reason we called the initiative 46664 is at the time, 8,500 people every day were dying of AIDS, and it was this like mindless, dehumanizing statistic. So the idea was, well, can we fight fire with fire? Is there a humanizing statistic? So I called Robben Island, and where Nelson Mandela was in jail, and were imprisoned, and they said he was the 466th prisoner in 1964. So for 27 years, he had 46664 on his prison jersey. So that was the name of the initiative. And again, we launched it. Our house band that day was Queen, which is pretty cool. We got Cat Stevens out of retirement for the first time in 25 years, and he sang Wild World with Peter Gabriel, who was actually in tears, because the first time Peter ever played the flute in the studio for an artist, it was Cat Stevens. Beyonce wasn't that big, so we had to perform during the day, which I really regret to this day. Anyway, so that kind of launched our career. And so from that moment, you know, we could actually kind of pick and choose the things we do. So as an example, I thought for social justice, who could top Nelson Mandela? Well, there's not that many people. So my thought in 2005 was, well, Anne Frank would have turned 75 this year. Why can't I throw Anne her 75th birthday tribute? So I reached out to Buddy Elias, her only living family member, and he said, who, by the way, who survived living in an attic, who didn't get discovered. And he said, you know, David, let me double check. I think there's a woman that would love to support this. And he called 2 days later from Vienna, and he said, Miep Gijs is in. She will be your chairwoman. Now, Miep Gijs at the time was pretty interesting because she was 97 years old. She's the woman who hid Anne and her family every day for 2 years, found Anne's diary, and it was personal to her because she bought Anne her first pair of high-heeled shoes, and Anne was a flower girl at her wedding. Now, with Miep Gijs and Buddy Elias, Lou Reed, Laura Linney, Whoopi Goldberg, Cyndi Lauper. So all of a sudden we built out this amazing initiative, social justice, using Anne Frank's life and legacy. So quickly touching on climate, 2.5 years ago in discussions with the UN. So really, we've created these cause brands, and we found it to be very effective to partner with various agencies of the United Nations for obvious reasons. And in discussions with the UN 2.5 years ago, they're like, listen, we can't get people to care about climate change. What can we do? Is there a branding exercise? What do we do? And so we talked about what we did 20 years before with Nelson Mandela, and that was what we came up with. The idea that we're going to reframe climate change as the fundamental human rights crisis it is, because women, children, the poor, the marginalized will continue to suffer the most as the climate catastrophe escalates. So we created the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Alliance, and it took off. So at COP26, we launched it with UN Human Rights. Our biggest supporters, Leonardo DiCaprio, Quincy Jones, Ellen DeGeneres, Camila Cabello. So we created this platform which made it safe for celebrities to promote climate. Because it was no longer political, we humanized the issue. And so the Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Alliance has now emerged as one of the largest climate justice initiatives in the world. And just last night at the Boulder Theater, we had the Right Here, Right Now Mini Global Climate Series. and it was hosted by UN Human Rights and the Recording Academy. So the producers of the Grammys are now working with us to create a series of concerts around the world that are focused on climate justice. So it's a long story short, but we're feeling pretty good right now. So
I'm glad this is being recorded. It's a lot to encapsulate, to go from Muhammad Ali to last night at the Boulder Theater. Thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Dave, to catch us up to speed on your remarkable career. Next, Emilie, if you could take 3 to 5 minutes to talk about your projects, and I think maybe some of you are familiar with Emilie's work already, being in the Boulder community now.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so as Jane mentioned, I am an assistant teaching professor here at CU Boulder in the Department of Cinema Studies and Moving Image Arts. And then I'm also the associate director of the Brackage Center. I was born, that sounds like a long talk, right?
Start.
I was born in 1974 in San Diego, and my family moved here to Boulder and Boulder County in 1975. So I grew up in this area and went to Fairview and then traveled for a while, came back and also got my undergraduate degree here at CU Boulder in the Department of Comparative Religious Studies. After that, I too worked at BMOCA, so Jane and I have some parallel trajectories. And then moved to Trinidad and Tobago, where I lived for 10 years. My husband was born there, and my son was subsequently also born there. And I worked as the creative director of the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, where I really cut my teeth as a cultural administrator and also as a filmmaker. I started making work there, first documentary, then experimental. And I was lucky enough to receive a grant from the Film Commission there for my first narrative feature film called Moving Parts, which is a story of human smuggling and sex trafficking set in a Chinese restaurant in Port of Spain, which is the capital of Trinidad and Tobago. So as Jane mentioned, I also was lucky enough to be involved and actually spearhead the creation of the Caribbean Film Database, which is still online, and it's the most comprehensive database of Caribbean films to date, as well as we launched and had one successful year of a Caribbean film market. So that was an exciting initiative for those of you who know about filmmaking. A lot of the work happens before you see it in the theater, particularly in development, where you're working to find partners to finance your work and to help you cast and crew the film. So that was really where I learned a lot about the industry. So I'm giving you this background because as an independent filmmaker, my orientation has never been coming out of Los Angeles or New York. It's really been a sort of decentralized experience. So after producing Moving Parts, which had a fairly successful festival run, mostly at Caribbean and international film festivals, I returned here and have continued my practice. So I have 3 projects that I'm currently working on. One, which is not a climate-driven piece, but it's I don't know exactly where it's going, but right now I have a fellowship, and it's to create a digital exhibition of a collection out of the Rare and Distinctive archives here at the university libraries. The collection is based on the life of Anne Roy, who was a fairly unknown Renaissance, an entirely unknown Renaissance woman, and the collection spans from 1940s to 1990s. A lot of the work is rooted in her interchange and exchange and experiences with indigenous peoples, and there's quite a few pieces of text, Super 8 films, a manuscript that are all unpublished. So I'm working on getting that out to the general public through a website. That's what a digital exhibition is, basically. But it may also be turning into a documentary film, I feel like. So then I'm working on a short documentary with a colleague from the Documentary Center, Eric Ishmael Coombs, which is it's a social look at rural mountain living and the interaction of humans with mountain lions. So up in Netherlands. Between October and December, we had 20 dogs that were killed by mountain lions, and there was this sort of a crisis within the community, and really interesting social media posts in terms of how people were, dealing with this crisis. So now someone within the community ended up killing one mountain lion, and then the killings of the dogs stopped happening. So it's not a nature documentary. It's really looking at the interchange between nature and humans and how humans rationalize our experience within that context. So then, I know I'm probably at 5 minutes, but my final project that I'm working on that I'll probably talk mostly about today is a near future climate drama set on the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. It's entitled Silt, and the protagonist is a Navajo botanist who's working for the Department of the Interior. This is a fictional film in which the water crisis has already happened. The Glen Canyon and Hoover Dams are closed, and the 2 reservoirs are empty. She is sent by the Department of the Interior to monitor 2 developers who are proposing new, smaller dams along the Colorado as a Band-Aid to the crisis. So that I am looking to produce in April of next year. So that's it for now. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. The documentary about the mountain lions, that connects with, I'll start with Ebert Interruptus, Honeyland, the movie that have you seen it? Okay. Ebert Interruptus, Jane, thank you for the kind words about my involvement with that. It's something the great film critic Roger Ebert started here at the conference in 1975, and I've been able to lead it the last couple of years, and so I want to invite everyone here to be part of our final session, which is later this afternoon at 4 p.m., just down the hall. We're in the East Ballroom. And we've been working our way through the documentary Honeyland, which is about a North Macedonian beekeeper who lives in a deserted village alone pretty much with her mother, but no one else is around, and she's using these traditional practices of beekeeping. And the documentarians came and started to film that. And then an itinerant family of 2 parents, 7 children, and about 150 cattle descend on this village and completely upend the way of living with nature, the communal nature that this woman had been handling her beekeeping. And so the filmmakers then documented that. So it's a very fascinating combination of narrative and documentary work. And what Interruptus does is, at this point, we're about 35 minutes into the film, because anyone in the audience can yell stop, make a comment, ask a question. We have a little conversation about it, and then we start the movie up again. And so, yes, we watched it in full on Wednesday. Yesterday, we made through 35 minutes of the movie, and we've got about 55 left to go, which will start this afternoon at 4 p.m. So you're all more than welcome to come join us for that. I've been thinking about this panel, the title of this panel, a little bit as a question to get my mind around it. So sort of, first of all, can you change the world through art and pop culture? And how can you change the world through art and pop culture? And we'd probably all agree, yeah, obviously you can. Otherwise, pretty much everyone on this panel and probably most of you in the audience have been wasting a lot of time and creative effort. So we believe you can change the world through art and pop culture. So then it becomes a more interesting question of how. What's the most effective? What means? What avenues of pop culture? And so I'm very eager to hear what the others have to say about that. I'm kind of, as a critic, on the other end of this, but I'm curious to hear how people working in the fine arts, who are curating art, who are using pop culture and producing music events or books, films of their own, how they think about this question. And there are a myriad of sub-questions. Do you set out to change the world through your art, or is that a bad place to start? I love hearing, I forget which project it was, but you said the phrase, I'm not quite sure where it's going yet. And I love when I hear artists say that, because sometimes we think of these very programmatic ideas that start an artistic project, but really I've found from artists that it can be more malleable. They don't always know what they're going for. And so that's exciting to hear, and I think that opens room for all these questions that we can explore today. Want to give a quick example of how this can be complicated, and it's regarding a new film that's in fairly big release. I'm not sure if it's come here to Boulder yet, but How to Blow Up a Pipeline. This also will bring us to the conference's theme of the global climate crisis. But this is an adaptation of a book that is essentially a manifesto that purports exactly what the title says. You know, here's how the practical ways if you wanted to this is how you wanted to respond to the climate crisis. Something drastic, something dramatic, something that the characters in the film, which is a drama, it's kind of taking the principles of the book and asking, what if a group of young people who did want to do this, they planned to blow up a pipeline in West Texas, an oil pipeline to disrupt production and also make a statement, right? So if you were in that place of desperation and anger and you felt this was your only cause, this would maybe be a way out for you, a light at the end of the tunnel, even though it's also a very destructive act. So that film is interesting because it plays as a heist film in a lot of ways. We meet these characters right as they're beginning the project. They're in this abandoned house in West Texas. They're assembling the materials, and they're setting out to do this. So it's kind of watching the steps like a heist film. And then in the final few moments, it becomes something more like a political statement, where at some point the characters are actually talking to the camera and stating, and it's in the trailer, this is an act of self-defense. And at that point, the movie turns into something closer to, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but propaganda. You know, there is a clear message it's projecting. Another filmmaker, Kelly Reichardt, who I love, made a movie about 10 years ago called Night Moves, which was about Jesse Eisenberg was in it, Dakota Fanning, 3 young people who plot to blow up a dam near Oregon. And it's a totally different movie because it's more interested about the psychological motivations. It's ambivalent about their cause, though it respects where they are and why they want to do it. And what's interesting to me is I find Night Moves much more unsettling because at the end it hasn't told me how to think, and it hasn't given me its manifesto. That's me. That's what moves me, but that doesn't mean that's the right way to do it. You in the audience, there might be others who watch How to Blow Up a Pipeline and come out of that feeling galvanized to do something about climate change. So there are a lot of ways to go about this. And again, I think hopefully we'll be able to cover some of those options in our conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jane, for the intro. And I apologize in advance for anyone who attended yesterday morning's session because I'm going to repeat some stuff I wasn't planning to actually, but then, you know, in this context, I think it's useful. So this is a good follow-up to what Josh presented because I too was considering the title of this panel, which is Changing the World Through Art and Pop Culture. And my mind, of course, went right away to activism. And it's really interesting, the film you brought up, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, because I wanted to start my intro by talking about the fact that I don't consider art to be activism. And as an artist, I can't call myself an activist. I associate activism with physical acts like, you know, showing up, well, I do show up at protests, but it's also, you know, I mean, the extreme end would be blowing up a pipeline, tying yourself to a tree. I mean, it's doing these frontline activities. And making art, to me, is not about those very concrete actions, but it's about bringing up, troubling all of us, to prompt us, prod us, to kind of unsettle us. Inspire us, for sure. I mean, that's what we all assume art can do, but really, for me, it's most exciting when it unsettles us. And so it's delivering something that's totally unexpected. That's when it's really live. That's when art counts for me, both as a maker and as a viewer. As Jane mentioned, the inspiration for me through really the last couple of decades is anger and just rage at the atrocities and social injustices that continue to be perpetrated across the globe. And so how do I respond? And so I do try to respond through my work. So for instance, I'm working on a project called SRS Silk Road Songbook right now. And this grew out of focusing on land and the concept of landscape, which are two very different concepts. Well, land is a concrete reality. Landscape is our perception of land. And I was really interested way back in realizing that what happens on the land becomes invisible over time. And so there's a lot of erased history, and this is intentionally erased by whoever is in charge at the point in time. And so how do you dig up, how do you surface those invisible histories? So a lot of the work I've been doing over the last couple of decades is related to that. This one, SRS, Silk Road Songbook, is actually a little more optimistic than some of the other works I've done over the last decade. I did create an audio-video tour called Tour that visited former genocide sites and using Lullaby as a way to draw viewers across these lands that actually look like anyone's backyard visually. But SRS is tracking a former major route on the Silk Road, and it's bookended by Arzu Özkal, who is my collaborator, and my own ancestral roots. So between Istanbul and Xi'an, a number of places along Central Asia and in Iran, we've been working collaboratively with groups there, musicians, artists, curators, ethnomusicologists, etc. And so we give them complete control, because that's absolutely essential in terms of selecting the landscape, selecting the musical genre, and creating the lyrical content for what they will produce. And they're producing original songs that are then recorded in the landscape. So it's women's voices singing these songs on the land. The land becomes a visual anchor that ties all 5 places together. So we're actually on the last production in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, that will hopefully be done by the end of this month. And it's been an ongoing project since 2016-17. So it's been a huge learning process, and having to also consider it through, continue producing through the lockdowns, which actually was a really good thing that happened, because it took us out of their hair. We didn't show up as, foreigners drawing attention. They could just do their thing, and we were just collaborating remotely with them. So thank you, pandemic. It actually probably helped us in that way. But yeah, so just in terms of land, it's in relation to climate change, certainly that is at the root of what we're all concerned about. And when I think of land, it's not just terra firma. It's the water, the air, our bodies, and our communities. So place, culture, etc. Human rights, certainly. We cannot talk about climate change without talking about human rights. They need to be always considered together in tandem. Thanks.
Whew. I think, as you can see, our panelists have such a deep well of knowledge, and I think that's why I wanted to sort of lighten the load by asking a quick fire question. Because I think it is so difficult to separate the interconnectivity. We know obviously all these issues are interrelated, but I think that personally for myself is part of why it's so overwhelming and can often be paralyzing, right? How do we address this climate change? Where do we start? I think that these projects demonstrate, the way that it is intersectional, but I just want to challenge the panelists to say potentially one word or one phrase as to where their entry point or where they feel the most urgent need for attention is. I think that in this, social media landscape, within all of this, we're all potentially overwhelmed. And so I'm just curious if there's a way that you can respond to this. What if you could only change one thing about the world? It's a big question, but what would you change? But you can only say like one phrase.
Well, I believe in the climate crisis, it's fundamental to get people to understand that it's a human rights crisis. And I believe that the arts really do have an amazing ability to reach and resonate with people on an emotional level. So I think it's a very powerful tool.
The Colorado River.
Oh my goodness. Are you serious with this?
Yeah. I'm getting you off your,
Okay.
your.
Well, as far as the arts are concerned, I think there's an opportunity to turn it towards, this is already more than a phrase.
Yeah, you
Here's
can
the
only
phrase.
say a phrase.
Here's the phrase, save the beauty. And that means like we need to know the and this is, I see James Baylock here, he gave a wonderful keynote, but it's kind of inspired by that, where the facts were laid out, the dire facts. And then his wonderful photography was shown that captured the reality of that, but in the context of beauty. And I think, we can be overwhelmed by the situation and look at it as this thing that's inevitable, that's coming for us, and we feel paralyzed. But if we reframe it as, let's move to save the beauty that's here, which art is particularly suited to depict, that might be a different posture.
Millie?
I mean, the first word that came to my head, and the only word, is equity.
Yeah, that's great. Well, that was really to, address the first part of this panel, changing the world, right? What does that mean? And then I think the latter part of our panel, through art and pop culture, and I'm really fascinated, working in the arts the majority of my career, but also being obsessed with pop culture. I'm really fascinated to hear from the panel where they think the lines are blurring with art and pop culture. Specifically, I think through the lens of accessibility. I think that the access, right, to this knowledge, being able to Google pretty much everyone on this panel and to really just have all of this wealth of knowledge, but having it intersect in a very, where I think media, journalism, the news, film, it's all entangled. And I think particularly for the younger generation, where we stand now versus maybe where, we started before, where art, I think, was very sequestered into the ivory tower. Now, I think through accessibility and this push towards equity, where those lines blurred, I think you can speak to this very much from a
Well, I think it's interesting. So we've created a number of initiatives over the years. One I'm particularly proud of that's actually focused on climate is we started Photography for Humanity with UN Human Rights. And the idea is, and it's actually launched 5 years ago, we encourage artists around the world in their local communities, professional and amateur alike, to take photographs of people that are affected by climate change. And so I think last year we got about 8,000 photos from around the world. And then with the top photographs, we exhibit them at Fotografiska in New York and in Studio A right outside of the General Assembly. So it's a high honor if you're the winner or the top 10 finalists or top 10 honorable mentions, because all the delegates at the UN get to look at your work. And we were very proud, actually last year, Secretary General Gutierrez, he actually did a tour of the work and then was posting it on his social media. So I like the idea through art to create a platform really of hope and possibility for the public to engage with art.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think part of that question is who is listening, right? I think, again, to speak to sort of, maybe Emilie, you can also speak to who your audience is or who you hope your audience is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really occupy a space of pop culture except for this year I have become a Denver Nuggets fan, and they're number one in the Western Conference, actually. Never really have I followed a professional sports team. And I've gone to a few games and been really impressed by the 20,000 people who are at Ball Arena every game, and they play, 70 games or something. So I have been thinking about that in terms of when I'm then at a screening of experimental film in the Brackage Center and we've got 8 people in the room, thinking about how to reach an audience and how to not necessarily pander to stories that rely on the hero's journey or tell a story from a perspective that we've seen too many times before, but still engage a Denver Nuggets audience. I have been thinking about that lately. And in independent film, in order to get distribution, you often see, for those of you who have watched smaller films, 1 star in the film. So right now I'm working on casting Silt, trying to make decisions about who could be a draw so that we could get distribution, so the conversation, even though it will be a relatively small film, can reach a larger audience. So if anyone knows Miles Teller, he's on the top of the list.
Dave, ask Dave. I'm sure he has some connection. Josh, I don't know if you want to speak to this.
Sure. Go Nuggets. Fun team. So that's exciting. Yeah, I think it's, when you're thinking of reaching different audiences, pop culture, popular culture, it's in the name, right? You're going for the widest. It's a way that's going to communicate to the widest number of people. So what does that? I mean, this kind of goes back to, I'm trying to think of a different word than propaganda, because we always think that's negative, but I think that's the most common denominator, not the lowest common. So it's going to be a different message then. The sensibility of an indie art film sometimes can reach an audience that big. That's when we get the breakouts. But often it's different than what the vast array of people at a Nuggets game, who we sometimes think of as, yeah, it's a vast array, but they're a monolith a little bit, which is not true at all. Like, if you go sit in that crowd and look around you, well, I don't know what it's like here, but I'm a Chicago Bulls fan. So, you go to a Bulls game and there's all different folks there. And so different messages are going to communicate to them differently. So in some ways, I feel like it's harder to communicate effectively to a pop culture audience some sort of activist, as you were saying, Millie, some sort of activist message. I wonder if it's easier, again, I'd rather hear from you guys on this, if it's easier if I'm an indie art film. I have a pretty good sense of what an indie art film audience is like, and I know how to talk to them. And that's, maybe you can talk more effectively to them and communicate your message or your experience, or present your questions for the pieces of art that want to be more like what it sounds like you like to make, Millie, is an exploration you want to invite them to be a part of. Maybe that's easier for smaller scale artistic projects? I'm not sure.
Well, I suppose, by any means necessary. So when you need to reach a wider audience for the sake of the project, then go for it. And otherwise not to worry about it, because even though as a teacher, we're always encouraging our students to consider your audience, like who's your audience. But then ultimately you have to just be completely self-aware, like not think about your audience and just think about the work. What does this work need to do? Like, what do I need this work to do? And that's the most honest place to come at it from. And then it falls where it falls, and some work's going to be more popular than others, so be it. You're going to have failures, and so as we probably all know from what goes viral, who has a formula for that? Like, no one's got control over that. So a friend of mine just posted something, or she posted something a year ago. She's a fellow artist, one of those humble visual artists, and she posted something a year ago, and then suddenly it's gone viral. We were sitting around at dinner, and her phone just kept pinging, pinging, pinging. And I said, probably an influencer picked up on this image. That's, you've got this whole herd following this influencer, and that's what's happening. So, you can't think about the numbers. just drive you crazy.
I think that's so interesting, and I feel like a very visual artist answer to not care. I think that you have the luxury to not care, because I think that's partially, as a curator, my job to make people care. And I think there is that moment of translation where I do find anything that you make, right, especially when you're an artist or producer, or you're doing it to have that connection, right? There's an element to everything that you do is about the basis connection, right? You're trying to connect the dots for yourself, but you're also trying to connect the dots for those people who are listening, or who I think that's what's interesting really about your work. You know, working in social practice tends to be temporal, and something that is, I think, something that is really sort of manifesting as it unfolds. So I do think that there is that element, and to kind of go back to what Josh was saying before, is just having sort of maybe beauty and that be at the base. But I am curious, sort of to go along this train of thought, you know, how, I think Millie, you addressed this earlier, how do you feel about being put in that position as a spokesperson? I think for you, maybe talking about your ethnic roots, or a person, you know, in Josh's position, being a spokesperson for a religious community, or Emilie speaking about a particular geographic location that has, you know, strong indigenous ties. And then, of course, I think to Dave, this question is pointed at, you know, how do you vet these celebrities to be spokespeople and to really take that message? And I guess that's where I always find it interesting. There's, I think within the sort of identity politics around art, I can say there's always like this burden of representation at the same point, right? That we're all dealing with these huge issues, and it seems like, you know, this panel was formed because everybody has a very unique lens and approach to the work. So that's a broad but specific question for each of you.
Well, I can jump in. For our work, actually, influencers are critical, and we'll actually hold up a project until we can actually get the influencer, because the way I look at it, it's the big domino that actually sets the other dominoes to fall, right? So when we launched Right Here, Right Now, we were talking to Leonardo DiCaprio's manager, and quite frankly, we would have pushed if he didn't support it. And it wasn't, you know, here's our initiative, will you support it? It's, this is why it's good for you. You have been promoting this issue, and we can actually help you. That's one of the things we do with influencers. We explain why it's in their interest. So we just think from a media point of view, it's huge. And so the minute Leonardo DiCaprio came in, Quincy Jones was like, oh, the water's warm, I'll jump in too. And then Camila Cabello. And then we had about 30 other celebrities. So our social media campaign that launched COP26, we had social posts that went out to 846 million people, because if you look at the social feeds of these people, they're huge. And so the UN and the Recording Academy would ask these people, would you do this? Now, we think they're doing it for the right reason, and we're not asking inappropriate celebrities that aren't authentic to the cause, but there's a point where we don't care as much. We want them to support what we're doing. So again, back to my Anne Frank example, the minute we got Miep Geiss, the woman who, you know, hit Anne for 2 years, then everybody came in. So for us, it's actually a starting point when we're creating these social justice initiatives. We're looking for that authentic voice so we can actually enter the space with some authority.
Do they go through any sort of training or
That's
you
a
know,
good question.
To be an ambassador, I guess, is there some sort of
That's exactly right.
educational component?
Yeah, so we make sure that they're on board and that they, you know, they're not going to go rogue, quite frankly, because I've actually had a celebrity do that, and that was really unfortunate.
Yeah.
So yes, but again, we're not trying to lead the witness. It's just they've got to believe that climate change is a fundamental human rights crisis, and if they believe that, and they're willing to share it with their 43 million followers, we're grateful.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's actually, sorry. Yeah, no, I'm just responding to what you said, Dave, and it's an interesting definition of activism. I mean, it's certainly a form of activism to tap into influencers and build the numbers. Like, how do you build the numbers are activism. You know, how do you build the numbers?
Yeah.
And I feel very arrogant for formally stating that I don't care about the numbers, they drive me crazy. But, I mean, when you're making work, it is true, you can't worry about it. But then in terms of disseminating the work, you know, and artists are terrible at that.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also the marriage. So as an example, we're working on a climate justice concert at the O2 Arena in London, and we're partnering with a group called Extinction Rebellion. Now, I don't know if you guys know them, but these are the folks that superglue themselves to the road or paintings, and, you know, they're pretty activists.
Yeah.
But we like that they're on the front line. They're going all in, but we can actually help give them a voice. And so it's that marriage of like the hardcore activists, they're doing the work.
Yeah.
I mean, we did the same thing when the atrocities were taking place in Darfur. You know, I mean, it's kind of random, but I was working with Amnesty International at the time, and we were looking at like famous people who had actually paid $20 a year for their Amnesty card. And it turns out that Yoko Ono and John Lennon, they paid $20 each every year. So I asked Yoko Ono if we could use her husband's catalog of music, and then all of the big bands came in and they created Instant Karma, and it actually empowered activists on the ground in Darfur, but it also gave, it brought what was going on to a global spotlight, so it was harder for people to hide. So I think it's really that marriage of the hardcore activists, but the influencers, I've just seen it, it's really helpful.
Yeah.
As an independent filmmaker, one of the things I find really exciting is that it's collaborative, and this idea of the auteur, I feel like, is dying or should be dead. And really, there's so many people who make a film happen, and there's a need for co-creation and conversation, particularly when it comes to representation, and depending on, you know, as Jane mentioned, a geographic space, like really thinking about the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, the Southwest, people who occupy that space and think about that space and work on behalf of that space. And then also the indigenous communities within, you know, the Colorado River corridor in particular. And then also not pigeonholing people. So having come out of working in the Caribbean, and having the opportunity to see non-white heteronormative males as the main characters on the screen all of the time, I am very much interested in allowing for characters to be individuals as well as the ethnicity or race or gender or orientation that they represent, so that a person doesn't necessarily have to be their identity. They can also be a specific character within a film. So co-authorship, I think, is extremely important in terms of being a mouthpiece, and even what you're saying about putting these events together. It's a collective endeavor, and so really recognizing that and moving in that spirit.
Josh.
Yeah, you're looking. Can you reframe that for me a little bit?
I know. Do we remember what we were talking about? I hardly do. I think I was talking about spokespeopleship, and maybe you can speak more about it as like if people look to you as an authority now figure in terms of, I think your platform is unique because of the context in which you're presented in the Christian.
Okay.
Space. I think that Christianity and pop culture, already is a panel unto itself, but I think if you can speak about how, particular to yourself, being a spokesperson or an authority, how that plays into in both positive and negative ways, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of hope not. I haven't gone to seminary, and so I like to think of myself as, walking alongside other people who are passionate about pop culture, genuine about their faith, and have maybe not found a place where there didn't seem to be some tension there. And I was fortunate enough to, be raised in a Christian home where that didn't exist, but I was certainly a part of other communities where that was the prevailing understanding. And you can't listen to this, you can't watch this. I'm sure people in the room have experience that. And there's certainly a place for discernment, and at Think Christian, we practice discernment as well, and want to really watch carefully and think about what we're watching and listening to. But I do think about Think Christian as a community as well, as I said, of like-minded people. And so I don't know if we're authority figures. Maybe at the best we're modeling a way to be fans of pop culture and serious and intentional about your faith. So maybe we're modeling more than anything else. And it's exciting to, sometimes when I go out and speak, often it is at Christian colleges, and I'll usually have, a freshman come up and be like, boy, this is my first year away from home. I can watch whatever I want. And they love that, but they're also nervous about it, right? It's like the frightening freedom. And so we're just trying to be a place where it's like, well, here's one way to do that, right? Instead of just throwing yourself in your dorm room and watching, whatever thing was ever banned for you. But it's pointing them again to the good art that we think deserves attention. And that's a whole nother track I could go down. It's like paying more attention to the aesthetics than the message, because I think religious traditions can sometimes worry about the message more than the aesthetics, but I won't get into that now. But that's another thing we try to do. So
yeah, I guess to kind of incorporate a question from the audience as well. This is, again, Josh, I'm curious. That said, I think because, again, Christianity can be associated with conservatism. I think that there's a notion too about conservatism being maybe there's climate deniers within the community, right? So I'm curious in that sense of this person is also asking, have you ever had a negative audience response to your work, and if so, how do you respond to that? So I guess when we have authority or we have prestige in our positions, there's always that criticism and being a critic yourself. I'm curious how you have experienced this.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, Think Christian, when I first came on board, it was modeled as a sort of a conference on world affairs. We had, we wrote about, try to believe this, politics. Things had not gone insane yet. This was like 2011. So we wrote about politics, we wrote about science, we wrote about business, all of this, again, like, what are these questions? How should we think about this Christianly, basically? And we pivoted in 2016, 2017 to pop culture for a couple of reasons. One was that was the strength of my background. Two was we thought we could build more community. We were kind of spread thin. We would have a person write for us once or twice a year because that's the only time we wrote about business. So we wanted to condense, focus, and things were getting nuts in terms of I don't even want to say his name, but we could not conceive for a small nonprofit ministry, very bare bones, how we could do a good job covering a certain presidential candidate and do our work well and provide fruitful content. So we pivoted to pop culture, and it's been a great decision because that community has been built. I feel better about what we are producing and offering. So yeah, I think that answers the question. It's yes, and that is how we responded.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Emilie, maybe I would ask you a similar question working in China or, Xi'an at least. Curious, especially with China also having climate issues, to put it mildly. Do you ever encounter, barriers or a negative response from, I don't know how it is lately, but if there's any governmental pushback on some of your projects?
Oh, this one, the SRS for sure. I mean, not yet, but we actually mounted a work in progress installation of the project in end of December 21. Yeah, and it actually it passed 2 censorship reviews. We had to put it through 2 censorship reviews, and it passed. That's because at that time we hadn't folded in Uyghur community, which I still haven't been able to do, and I just let it go because it becomes my, pet, and it's not the project anymore. So we're dealing with people. And we're collaborating with people who have to deal with totalitarian regimes and censorship. So it's a very loud reality, and this is part of the challenge with disseminating the work too, and then back to the numbers question, and is it a matter of certainly this has to be accessible for all of our collaborators. And so can it have a popular release? I don't know. I mean, these are all things we're having to deal with now as we're nearing completion, like going into post-production. So yes, very, very, very loud, important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not trying not to deal with it until we have to, thinking about it.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
We only have 10 minutes left. I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. I think could be maybe a little bit of a yes/no, but in the sake of time, this question is, does going viral actually create cultural change? Which I think is a great question, but maybe we can go again down the line, starting with you, Millie.
Oh, sorry, I was still
To
in
your,
my head.
I know. Well, to your point, I think, talking about going viral earlier, I think it is a great question. What is the actual impact of going viral? And I'm curious, have we noted long-term change from anything that's gone viral?
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's certainly a long-term change, yeah. Well, viral is I think it's a pretty recent phenomenon because social media didn't exist not that long ago. Mm-hmm. But then if you think historically, the human behavior behind that hasn't changed. So certainly, in terms of trying to spread the information or the propaganda or share things, that hasn't changed. And okay, so I mean, I'll just quickly insert here the fact that in our research for the history of the Silk Road, it wasn't those grand caravans, that moved that culturally influenced and moved intellectual property around and cultural effects. It was migrants and refugees. I mean, this was a not highly trod route, and it was people forced to move, maybe sometimes for opportunity, but oftentimes forced to move from their homeland. And so it hasn't changed. And if you think about the rate of migration now, it's frightening. I mean, it's escalated so much due to, certainly in great part, climate change. So, but also, which is certainly under, it's our fault, as is war and violence and intolerance. So all of these things that force people to uproot. And so, I mean, I think the viral is related to the technology we have right now, but I think we have to get our head out of being in love with that technology or being awed by it and realize that actually things are the same. I mean, it's, and to realize that, or to basically not be arrogant about achievements, that we're still dealing with the same kinds of stupidity that we, there's a great Einstein quote, and it's purported to be his words, but he said, here, hold on. I don't want to paraphrase it. Just give me one second. Bear with me for just 1 second. It's, okay. Sorry. Oh yeah, here it is, okay. Two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity. And I am not completely sure about the universe.
That's great. Josh, do you have something to say on the subject?
Virality, can it affect real change? Well, I'm curious to hear what Dave says, because I feel like he's been involved with things that have had that amount of reach, so I'll be brief. My instinct is to say, no, because I think of what was it, is this dress blue or black or whatever that was. Like, I think of that as virality, and your perception was the entire world was obsessed with that for a week or whatever. And now people probably don't even know what I'm talking about, but it was a thing. And so, but I do wonder if, and I'm trying to think of an example where you can point to change from a viral tweet, image, concert, something like that. Nothing's coming to mind, but I see the potential if like an inflection point, if virality can create an inflection point. And it's not one of these silly things. So maybe that's what, going back to the movie I mentioned, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, maybe that's what the characters in that film, I know that's what social media was part of their strategy, right? Is that they were going to document this and get virality. Now, would something like that result in policy change, corporate change? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, I can jump in. I think there was an image of a little boy in Aleppo, Syria, who was all bloodied, and he was in the back of an ambulance, and that image went viral, and it changed the game. Because so what I would say is, it's what is it, right? So, but there's some images that are so visceral, that are so hard to ignore. We find that it can be effective, but we also have, we know that it cannot be effective, right? Just sheer numbers, that doesn't really stick, right? And as an example, if you had, here's a silly example. Years ago, we had the band One Direction. They did a social campaign for us, and nobody cared. And then we had somebody like Cher. She did a social campaign, or Cyndi Lauper does a social campaign, and her followers care and they take action. So it depends who's the carrier of the message and what the message is.
I think to follow up on that, I'm going to paraphrase the student's question, or take the liberty to. I guess with that said, Dave, is there any way you collect data, or how do we measure that, right? How are we measuring change other than just sort of saturating the visual and social media landscape? How do you quantify? How would you quantify change, maybe?
Well, that's tough. So it depends what you're doing, right? So if you're asking for people to participate, how many people sign up? If you're asking for people to retweet and repost, how many do that? So, we actually collect that data. So we know if there's a huge social campaign, we know that actually the undercurrent might even be bigger than the initial push, because people really, they gravitate towards it and then they push it out. So I think it kind of depends.
I also just want to jump in here and say I believe everyone on this panel is over 40. And as the mother of a 15-year-old and also teaching, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, I think that we don't even have a pulse on how the sort of social media landscape has changed the thinking and the acting and the being of young people. So, I see my son as being completely influenced by all of this technology and way of being. So
that's a good point.
I think I have a 26-year-old son, and I mean, what I've been impressed with over the years is how, he would be like part of the earlier digital native generation, and I've been impressed at how they are able ultimately, like your son's 15, so he'll get there, but they're actually ultimately able to sort through it and cast away stuff. And
I hope so.
Yeah, it'll happen with a mom like you. It'll happen.
But I think that's the fascinating part of like just this avalanche, this constant. I mean, even for myself, I'm middle-aged, as Emily's pointed out. But I think that that's the challenge, right? And that's where I think the blurred lines are continuing to just blur even more. The way that we're being introduced to these subjects around climate change, I think, are often through pop culture, and that even the news cycles have become sort of sensationalized, right? So I think that I have a friend who teaches middle school, and she talks about Instafacts, right? That we're getting our news feed from Instagram. And so I think that there is such an interesting positionality with social media and being this huge catalyst for these blurred lines, again, between art and pop culture. And that it's not necessary, I think, to Millie's point, that to define it necessarily, right? Or I think even to separate them, because again, as we've all said, I think in this panel, that everything is interrelated. I think maybe that's the takeaway, but that art truly is a vehicle for people to, better understand, and for people like, Millie, who's translating it in these conceptual ways, and as well through film and music. I think we can all agree that it's such a powerful tool to be able to sort of push the various needs of us as a collective humanity. I think we're basically out of time, but I'm sorry to the people whose questions I didn't get to. I think there's one specifically for Dave I can ask after the panel, whomever asked. But thank you all again for coming, and it's been such a pleasure to talk with all of you, so thank you.
Thank you.
Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.